and welcome to the Wine Enthusiast podcast, your serving of drinks culture and the people who drive it. I'm Samantha Setti, senior web producer here at Wine Enthusiast. Today, I have the pleasure to speak with Michael Alberty, wine writer for The Oregonian and Wine Enthusiast, and professional wine taster. In a recent article for Wine Enthusiast, Michael explored the pleasures and unavoidable downsides of his chosen profession that led him to ask, is tasting 3,000 wines a year hazardous to your health? Is it even sustainable? And how does one define balance in alcohol consumption when it's literally your job? Let's take a step back and hear from Michael himself. Well, Michael, it's so great to have you here on the show today.
It is great to be here. This has been a fun ride for the last couple of months since that article went out.
Totally. And so, mentioning the article, can you give us a little bit of a rundown of what you wrote about for our listeners online?
Sure. So a friend of mine, probably shortly after 4th of July, I'm guessing, maybe a couple of weeks, so it was like late July, a friend of mine sent me a copy of this article that Pete Wells had written where he announced that he was going to quit reviewing restaurants for the New York Times. And it was his reasons for quitting the restaurant reviews that kind of caught my attention because it paralleled some things that had been happening in my life in the 6 to 8 months prior to that. And it all sounded very familiar to me. And basically what he laid out was the fact that he was starting to have some health concerns and had, what sounded to me like I described as a come to Jesus meeting with a doctor. And it sounded very familiar what I'd gone through. I was, consuming a whole lot of wines for reviewing wines. So between my job writing about wine for the Oregonian newspaper in Portland, our state city newspaper of record, and reviewing wines for Wine Enthusiast with a focus on the Pacific Northwest, back of the envelope calculation, I sat down after reading that Pete Wells article, and I thought, I last year put roughly 3,000 wine samples in my mouth over the course of the year. Now, I was swishing and spitting, but it was still kind of, it gave me pause because I had already looked at his article and tried to figure out, my God, how many meals does I eat in a year? And I thought, wow, I bet you I consume a lot of wine samples during the course of the year. And that led to this whole thought process. And so I thought back to when I first agreed to do wine reviews for Wine Enthusiast magazine. So I review wines from Oregon, Washington, and Canada. At least I did when I started. That's now expanded. So I now cover everything from Alaska and Hawaii all the way over to like Minnesota now. So there's more states and potentially more wines, I guess. But when I first told my doctor and when I first told my dentist what I was about to start doing, because they knew I reviewed wine, that I wrote about wine for the Oregonian, I told him I'm going to probably put around 2,400 wines in my mouth over the course of a year. And the doctor was very low key about it, but my dentist was like, you have to be, you kidding me? And I said, no. And so the next thing I know, I'm on a special prescription fluoride toothpaste that tastes like bubble gum, and I'm having to do an oral rinse. And for both doctor and for dentist, they said, we no longer want to see you every 6 months. We want to see you every 4 months. And so I was like, okay. So we decided that we were going to have to keep on top of that. But they were a little taken aback by how much wine I put in my mouth.
Yeah, 3,000 is a lot. We could take a moment and appreciate that there. And it makes me think about when I was a kid, I watched a lot of Food Network, and you're never really thinking these judges are probably eating so much cake, so many cookies or whatever. And applying that to wine, when you chose to get into tasting, it does sound like you were proactive. So you were thinking a little bit ahead, but was this something that was at the forefront of your mind when you chose to be a professional wine taster?
No, not at all, because my journey of tasting wine began around the year 1999, 2000. I was in wine retail in the state of Illinois, and, we were making decisions on what wines we were going to put in our stores, and the staff, we would all taste probably easily 75 to 100 wines a week, during the time of the year. And I think we were spitting mostly. So I got kind of used to the notion of, putting a lot of wines in your mouth. And then you'd go off to commercial tasting events like portfolio tastings. We'd go to Chicago for like the Terry Tisa portfolio tasting. And, there's like 75 Rieslings to try over the course of a day. And then almost an equal amount of grower champagnes in a day. And we used to joke that it was a great way to find out if you had the beginnings of a cavity. Because at the end of the day, drinking, tasting, and swishing all of that Riesling and then grower champagne, you could pick up a little bit of an ache on a tooth if you had a little bit of a fissure starting. And we had one employee that went to his dentist and said, "This tooth hurts. I just went to this tasting and this tooth hurts." And the dentist said, after looking at it with the x-ray and everything, now there's nothing there. And then 6 weeks later, he was getting a cavity drill. It was like an early detection system. So I was used to it from having been in wine retail for so long. So thought, intellectually, when I started to work for Wine Enthusiast and I was being interviewed, Adam Strum said, "You can count on probably 2,400 samples of wine coming your way over the course of the year." Intellectually, you say, "Oh, big deal." But then when the wine starts showing up and you're tasting wine, like we probably do blind tastings every day of the week. We rarely take a day off.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Well, once, because you can't fall behind, incoming wine just keeps coming and coming. And so you want to keep on top of it. And so you can get reviews done in a timely fashion. So usually, so over the course of a year, there's probably 2 weeks of days where we don't do a tasting. So like it's a lot of wine. And intellectually, I thought no big deal. But then when it started happening, started piling up. And so I noticed early on, started for Wine Enthusiast a couple of years ago, I noticed early on that it became harder to lose weight if you were trying to drop some pounds, which I was, and which I still am. And it seemed like something was slowing down, and I just always assumed that it was because, you're getting older, your metabolism is finally changing for the worst. And so I never really thought about what I was doing in terms of consumption, because you're spitting, right? You're swishing and you're spitting.
Yeah, I'd love to know more about that. You've alluded to that quite a few times now in terms of spitting, and our listeners might be familiar that you might spit at a wine tasting, so you're sloshing it around your mouth, you're not really swallowing, but that still is in your body, even for a brief period of time.
Yeah, and so that's where all of this kind of came to a head. I was getting ready to write something about my take on what it's like from a wine perspective of what Pete Wells went through, because what I do is really extreme. There's probably not too many people out there in the world that like put these many samples of wine in their mouth in a year. I talked to a few of them. And so, but it's like, I called it an extreme sport. It's like an extreme sport, but none of us were really training for it. None of us were taking into account what we were absorbing. And, if you were to go to every event that a wine reviewer gets invited to for wine dinners, special events, people's, winemakers' birthdays with library selections, if you took up all those invitations, you would be out doing something, 3-4 times a week. So all of that just piled up. But what we weren't thinking about was how much you absorb when you swirl and then spit. And so I was talking to a really brilliant physician named Dr. Miles Hassel. He's an internal medicine specialist who practices at the Comprehensive Risk Reduction Clinic at St. Vincent's Hospital in Portland. He also established their integrated medicine program at the Providence Cancer Institution of Oregon in Portland. And so Miles keeps up on all of the data that has to do with the things like the Mediterranean diet. And he keeps up with all of these medical studies like nobody's that I know. So when it comes to interpreting the data that people like the World Health Organization attempt to interpret for people, Miles has a little bit of a different way of looking at that data. So I talked to him. I said, "What about how much am I absorbing?" And he said, "That's a great question." And he came back to me and he said, I found one study only. It was over in the Netherlands. It was called the Bacchus study, BAC, and then in parentheses CHUS, because the researchers had a sense of humor, BAC for blood alcohol level. And so they took a group of people and they put a basically an ounce of wine in their mouths, which they swished and spit, and then they waited a few minutes and they repeated it and did this like 10 times in an hour. They evaluated their blood alcohol levels versus people that weren't spitting. And so Miles looked at their results and he told me on the phone, he goes, I think it's like a 5% absorption rate that we're looking at here, if I'm interpreting their data correctly. I said, okay. I said, what does that mean? And he goes, for every 20 samples of a 1 ounce sample that you consume or that you swish and spit, that's like consuming a 5 ounce glass of wine. And so I thought about it. When we do blind tastings, I put an ounce in my mouth, swish, spit. And then I sit there and think about it for a minute and I'll write some notes down and then I'll do it one more time. So I'm actually doing 2 1 ounce samples for every wine. So I looked at that and thought, that means maybe over the course of a week, I'm consuming 5 to 7 glasses of wine that I wasn't counting.
That's even like an addition to maybe, it's nighttime, you want to pour yourself a glass of wine, enjoy it in a different way, which
Yes.
now that I think about it, it's probably really different. You have these kind of 2 lives in the wine world, one where you're actually able to kind of leisurely drink it. And not that the tasting isn't fun, but it's different. There's a different motivation there, a different purpose.
It is. And what I found after a few months of being at Wine Enthusiast, when you're doing that much blind tasting, what I found is that I was actually less likely if we went out to order a glass of wine. It was like in high school, I had friends who like, oh my God, we got a job at the local pizza parlor. This is fantastic. We get free pizza every night. And then after 6 weeks, they were like, we don't ever want to see pizza again. And so we would go out and I'd be more excited to see a glass of beer than, wine. So that was just kind of the general reaction to it. But I was very carefully following the recommended guidelines of wine consumption for a male adult, which was 2 glasses of wine a day. That's fine. For women, 1 glass a day. That's fine. And so 14 glasses of wine during a week, but I wasn't taking into account those extra glasses. And so I talked to my doctor about it. He goes, okay, just pare back and try to do it so that you're at 1 glass of wine a day, in addition to what you're doing. He said, just on nights that you do blind tastings, limit yourself to just a glass later on in the night, or maybe not at all, whatever works out for you. So that's what I started doing. So I had to take into account, I call it the hidden consumption. I don't know how many people, sometimes people ask me, what does a day look like for a wine reviewer? You're sitting in a chair. Other than the morning when you go out for, in reaction to all the stuff that happened with all the increased wine consumption and trying to find that sense of balance and to drop weight, to keep blood pressure from going up. And that was like going up at about the same time as the Wine Enthusiast thing started. So trying to keep all those things in check while you're sitting all day and you're sitting all afternoon, it's tough. And I talked to other wine reviewers. I think in the article I mentioned Patrick Comiskey, who, has worked for Wine and Spirits and Los Angeles Times. And I asked him, I said, am I nuts? I mean, how much wine have you been consuming in a year? And he goes, well, during the heyday, he said, I think I was around 3,000 too. And he said, when I, moved from San Francisco to Los Angeles, all of a sudden I was walking less, because in San Francisco, you walk, everywhere on the hills, And he said, I started putting on, I think he estimated 2 pounds a year. And then he said, for a very long time. And I said, yeah, that's kind of what I'm going through right now. So
it's not just the wine. There's a whole environment and ecosystem that this day to day involves, right? Like you said it yourself, good for you for prioritizing that first thing in the morning and getting outside, because it's so many of these things aren't accustomed to the things our bodies need, which is crazy. But it's refreshing too to think that, maybe not refreshing, but hopeful, thinking that it's not just the tasting. It's not like this one factor. There's a whole environment of things going on. And so what does balance look like for you in that aspect?
This has been such an important part of this, because when all this started happening, I realized I was going to have to, I felt compelled to write this article, and I knew I was going to be doing it. So like I said, I knew I had to talk to various people. So I talked to somebody at Oregon Health Science University's dental school that's an expert in this kind of area of acid. And I talked to, like I said, Dr. Miles Hassel, and Dr. Hassel has this great sense of what balance looks like. And so when he said, I looked at all the major studies done globally on this impact of alcohol and things like that. And I think the quote that's in the magazine is, he said, in every major epidemiological study of which I'm aware, and I don't use the word every lightly, when you look at alcohol consumption, people with low to moderate consumption have lower total mortality than those who drink too much or don't drink at all. And it's that sweet spot right in the middle. And he said, I have an idea of where the sweet spot is, and I don't like to go on the record too much about the sweet spot because it freaks some people out. They go, oh no, that's too much. That's too many glasses. But
Totally.
based on my conversations with him, I feel comfortable with the 2 glasses of wine a day over the course of a week. So 14 glasses, unless you're trying to lose weight, unless you've got some other thing going on that you need to correct, in which case you ratchet down how many glasses of wine you're drinking. So I'm trying to keep myself at around 10, I think, right now. But he said, when you look at all those large peer-reviewed studies, he said alcohol consumption is one of the 4 or 5 factors most strongly associated with longevity. And think about all those Greek grandmothers. Think about, all the people that do what? A lot of walking, do a lot of vegetables, do a lot of olive oil, do what he calls an omnivorous diet. So he said, in terms of balance, other than moderate alcohol consumption, he said the other factors for longevity, the best outcome, are an omnivorous diet, exercising, not smoking. And then I think he paused for effect with me on the phone. He goes, and not being fat. And then he goes, how's your waistline doing? I said, well, this is where we need to work. And so I think that his message that alcohol consumption is right up there with don't smoke, don't be fat, don't eat processed foods, and I won't say a fast food chain, but don't eat processed foods and all that stuff. Instead, do a more balance between protein and vegetables. He goes, the fact that alcohol is right up there with those, we need to remember that, and we need to make a big deal about that. So when someone tells you there are no safe levels, it depends on how you parse the data. And if you're coming at it from an attitude of, and a lot of the people like the World Health Organization or here in Oregon, the Oregon Health Authority, they don't do nuance well. Nuance doesn't serve their purposes. If you want to get people, if you think there's a global alcohol consumption problem and you want to correct that, do you tell people 7 to 10 glasses a week is okay? No. You go 0, nothing safe, and try to scare people. And
it's easy. It's easier to understand.
In terms of nuance, I feel totally okay with drinking the number of glasses of wine in a week that I do now.
And it's funny because it's so individualized. And then it's also, we speak about balance, and maybe I'm cynical, but I feel like balance is a myth because when it comes to health and like what is healthy, we're always hearing 2 opposing sides. We're hearing do this or don't do that. And usually there's studies confirming both of the sides, which just makes it even more confusing for the layperson who maybe isn't in this every day. And I just think that balance is something that we need to figure out ourselves. And it doesn't have to be either or, and not one thing is going to make you healthy and not one thing is going to make you unhealthy. And there's just so much, even in these studies, that's going on behind the scenes that is not necessarily measurable. And there's just so much lately, the buzz, and I know we've talked about this offline a little bit about how there is this kind of neo-prohibitionist movement, but is that right? We don't know. Maybe talk for another day.
Yeah, I think you can go too far in both extremes. So like when Dr. Hassel said, you've got people who drink 0 and you've got people that are drinking way too much. Right in the middle there are the people that are drinking moderate amounts of alcohol, and they have the best outcomes in terms of longevity and stuff like that. Not the people who drink 0. To me, that resonates when I think about the World Health Organization and no safe levels, or if the U.S. government decides to say, we're going to just say there are no safe levels. We're not going to tell you 2 glasses of wine for men, 1 for women a day. I want to keep that data from actual global studies that have gone for 20, 30 years sometimes following people. And we listed all of the studies in that magazine article in Wine Enthusiast that Miles was talking about, but just to go check them out. But yeah, so that middle part for balance. And so you asked me about what balance looks like for me now. And so I'm accepting way fewer invitations. So if I do accept your invitation to go to somewhere for a winery-related event, I hope you realize it's like one of the very few I accept. So whatever's going on must be really good or really super important, because I don't do too many of them. Like I said, moved up significantly. Instead of seeing a doctor once a year, twice a year, seeing a doctor 3 times a year, seeing a dentist 3 times a year. But also, we talked about Thanksgivings coming up, and those are difficult times to, maintain a sense of balance. And so what we find ourselves doing in my family, we have family events going on, is, it's one thing to say to people, oh, just instead of having that second glass, just work a glass of water. Well, yeah, that's great, but it's not exactly so festive walking around a party with a glass of water. And so we've kind of started subbing in things that kind of look like you're having a beverage. So, whether it's a non-alcoholic beer or, during the holidays, my absolute favorite, I get no financial remuneration for them for saying this, but Thompson and Scott over in Europe, they make those non-alcoholic wines, including sparkling wines called Naughty, Noughty for not when it comes to alcohol. And their sparkling rosé, I think, is really, really quite good. So in terms of walking around with a little champagne glass filled with a sparkling rosé, and you mix that in over the course of the night, the regular alcohol you consume, it's a lot easier to kind of slide through those family settings and stuff like that.
I love that acknowledgement of that the holidays are coming up too, because it's this time of year where we are once again receiving so many different messages. And I mean, me personally, I'm a huge proponent of non-alcoholic drinks and like having a mocktail. And I think it just comes down to not making people feel bad about their consumption choices, whether it be wine or beer or water or whatever it is, because we just want them to feel seen. And that balance is going to look different seasons of the year, different days, different years of your life. If you're a professional wine taster or you're
right.
a pro athlete training for an event, I mean, I'd be damned if we have quarterbacks right now who are consuming as much wine as you are on the weekly. Like, that just wouldn't make sense. And it's a time of year where I feel like that's ultra sensitive, yet ultra out there. It's out there in the media.
It's darker earlier at night. I live in the area around Portland, Oregon, so it's like really rainy as well as being dark during the winter. And so, yeah, you can see those temptations easily to just put your feet up, get a fire going to the fireplace. And it's like, oh, let's just open up a bottle of wine, which is easy enough to do during these times of year. But I don't know if this will be useful for anybody else, but in terms of coming up with a balance, of course, talk to your individual physician, talk to your individual dentist, and figure out what the best course of action for you is. But also started keeping track of glasses of wine consumed in a little notebook that I have. And so I'll make a little note, a little tick, glass of wine, and then there's 2 columns: wine review, tasting, swishing and spitting, and one you open later. So at the end of the week, you can kind of take a look and go, how close was I? Did I stay within the boundaries? So you can kind of modify it up or down the next week, usually down, to kind of compensate if you went a glass or 2 over. But I found that just writing it down in a notebook, just think about it, really, really helped with that process. But, the holiday times are here. And I think another thing too is that in our household now, we no longer just open up a bottle of wine for the sake of opening up a bottle of wine, because we're, doing a blind tasting, and, that's like drinking wine. So you feel like you've had some wine. And so more special bottles get opened, as opposed to just like, oh, let's take this $20, $16 screw cap wine that we just bought at the grocery store. Let's just open it up and pop a glass of rosé just to be drinking a glass of rosé. It's like, we try to say, okay, if we're going to open something, let's make it be just something a little bit more important to us, a little more special. And then also you find yourself maybe not opening anything on that particular night, because it's like, got to have some occasion going on maybe or whatever. But it's just what I used to call thoughtless drinking is less of a thing now, because it's just not really super satisfying. All these other wines going on. So just try to do something that's important, that's good, And I know that you asked me about wines that I've had in my glass lately.
Yeah, what are you drinking lately?
Ever since starting to do this wine review thing where we're consuming a lot of wines in terms of swishing and spitting, I've been finding myself drawn more and more, for some reason, to white wine. I don't know why. I find myself drinking for pleasure. I find myself almost drinking less red wine than I used to. Maybe I shouldn't say that since I live in the land of Willamette Valley Pinot Noir. But I find myself being drawn towards more high acid, lower alcohol white wines. So lately, I've been really enjoying the white wines made by Gramercy Cellars up in Walla Walla. The Viognier, which I've always loved, but now they're making, I don't know that they started making it, but they make this this peak pool that, because I love peak pool. Now, a peak pool made in the U.S. isn't necessarily as inexpensive as a peak pool from, France, but I like that acid. I like that zip. I like that freshness to it, liveliness to it.
In addition to producing world-class content, did you know that Wine Enthusiast is also the premier shopping destination for wine lifestyle products? Just visit our shop at wineenthusiast.com, where you'll discover an amazing assortment of unique quality items guaranteed to enhance your wine experience. From glassware and accessories to thousands of unique wine gifts, it's like a toy store for wine lovers. And don't forget about protecting your wine. We are the nation's leading retailer of wine storage products. Whether you have 6 or 600 bottles, desire a wine cabinet or a custom-designed wine room, our free wine storage consultations will help you find the perfect wine fit for your collection. Visit wineenthusiast.com today. We bring wine to life. Brought to you by the Wine Enthusiast Shop. And to just backtrack one moment there, because I'd love to know if, of course, you feel comfortable, but you were speaking about how you now drink a little bit differently with your family and stuff. And how has, as you've grown in your career, has this affected how your family has their own balance and relationship with alcohol?
Yes, I've been fortunate that in some respects, so like, I know when I have a son who's a senior in college, and I know that a lot of people, when they have high school kids in America, they go through these periods where they're always worried about kids are out driving around on weekends. What are they up to? Are they imbibing in alcohol? Are they imbibing in other substances? So, then you get concerned about that stuff. But, in our family, my kid going through high school and into college was always doing long distance running and cross country team and high school track and stuff like that. And because his dad was a wine writer and he'd been around it his entire life, he could care less about wine for the longest period of time. Now he's kind of taking a more intellectual interest in it because he's interested in how wines are made, and he wants to know why, if you taste a wine and it tastes a certain way, what did they do? How is that wine made? Why does it taste that way? Why is there more alcohol in this one? So a lot of intellectual, I think the fact that he also studies things like chemistry probably plays into it. So only recently has he become interested in wine. But yeah, my wife goes through the same concerns that I do about, wow, I just swished and spit all this wine and I'm going to have a glass of wine. What does that mean in terms of our total intake for the week? So yes, it is a conscious, focused decision, conversations in our house. We're always talking about how much did we drink tonight? Did we drink a glass? Did we drink 2 glasses? So there's much more keeping track than 5 years ago.
Definitely. And so thinking about, since you've written this article, right, there was a before and an after, and you're kind of in this after now. What does that look like moving forward for you?
I don't know how close I came to saying I'm not going to review wines anymore because there's just so much because of the consumption. I don't think I came even close to saying, no, I don't want to do that, because I enjoy the work. I enjoy what I do. And I thought what I need to do is, like we said, talk to people and try to find that individual balance to work so that you can have a blood pressure where you want it to be, where you can drop the number of pounds you want to drop and keep them off. So I thought, I just need to train. I just need to do a better job of keeping track of the balance and trying to stick in that zone. And it's been difficult. We get to this time of year where it's like, okay, I have a birthday that occurs just before Halloween, so everything's all tied into that. And then you've got Thanksgiving, then you've got Christmas, And one of the bad things about family gatherings and social events is that because you're a wine writer, everybody wants to like put their foot forward. So everybody's like, I've got these 3 wines that I've been saving all year because I want to have you try them. So all of a sudden it's like family members want to pour wines for you. Friends of friends want to pour wines for you. So you have to like keep track of that. It's a constant temptation.
Yeah. And so, as we start to wrap up here, I guess, do you have anything else you'd love to share in regards to your experience since, whether it be the aftermath before this, how your relationship has changed with alcohol over time, or I know it's been a lot here, but, or even advice to someone who might be interested in becoming a professional taster and like this is a scary reality of it, right?
Yeah. I think that even if you're not tasting 2,000 to 3,000 wines in a year, I think that even at modest levels of alcohol consumption, one thing to really look out for is, and we've only just touched on it in this conversation, but the way that the acid involved impacts your teeth, it is really important to keep on top of that. The professor at OHSU that I talked to spoke about the need to maintain a baseline. So talk to your dentist about there's a thing called a digital scan where you can kind of like keep track of where you are right at that moment. And then you can kind of keep track of erosion of enamel and things like that over time. And it's a lot more involved than your average normal checkup. So, people that are getting into wine professionally and tasting more than the average human being, the teeth thing would be something I would really stress as being important to keep on top of. And the biggest piece of advice I got, and it makes sense, and I think most people that are in wine kind of have an idea that this is something you need to do, but I talked to the dental professor at OHSU, and he said, look, he goes, when do you taste wine? I said, we do the blind tastings like before dinner, so 4 to 5:30 p.m. And he said, perfect. He said, do you drink wine after dinner? I said, well, we'll have a glass of wine with dinner. And I call it the Patrick Comiskey rule now, because Patrick said, my new rule now is I don't put anything like alcohol or rich food or anything like that in my mouth after 9 p.m. unless it's a very special occasion. And so I thought that's a great rule. So, and it helps because the dental professor said, try to wait an hour. 90 minutes is even better, but try to wait about an hour before you brush your teeth at night. You've been drinking the alcohol, acid's on there. You don't want to like exacerbate it by brushing vigorously. So wait an hour to 90 minutes after you've had your last glass of wine or whatever you're drinking, and he goes, then brush your teeth. And he said, up your water level. And on the phone, he told me, he said, if I were you, I would take how much water I'm drinking during the course of the day, look at it, and try to make sure you're drinking a ton of water. And that helps with the dental situation. It also helps with body-related things too, but he said, drink a lot. And he said, if you can, try to make sure that there's not a lot of acid in the water. He goes, some waters that you drink, some locations, he said, if you can get alkaline water, if you want to put a little bit of baking soda, a little bit in your water to help correct for that. But he goes, you don't want to be adding acid by drinking water. So try to keep track of if you're drinking a bottled sparkling water from Europe, take into consideration what might be in there in terms of minerals, acidity levels, things like that. So water, wait, water. So those are the 2 messages I got for the dental port. And yeah, and a great fluoride toothpaste.
It's crazy. Yeah, going into this conversation took me 40 minutes to realize how impactful tasting wine is on your teeth. That is not where my mind originally went, but definitely worth noting because it makes sense.
Right. So I started at Wine Enthusiast a couple of years ago, and between all of the wine that goes into my mouth, all of a sudden in the last couple of years, I had, after not having any issues for a long time, all of a sudden, at my advanced age in life, I have 2 cavities being drilled. I'll tell people just really keep track of that enamel and protecting it.
Right. Definitely want to send that message home that this is extreme wine drinking, not everyday normal consumption. Y'all are all good, I promise. And
yeah, but talk to your dentist. Just, keep those appointments and keep those checkups going.
Definitely. Well, would you have done it any different though?
No, I came to the conclusion that it wasn't moderate wine consumption or slightly more than moderate wine consumption that was the issue. The issue was me. And so I figured I need to do things to hit that balance so that we talked about that involved me. So I want people to continue to enjoy drinking wine. I want them to, when the day comes and you start to see more and more of these messages from the World Health Organization or whoever, I want you to take those with a grain of salt. More important to talk to your individual doctor than to listen to a public service announcement from the World Health Organization. Talk to your individual doctor, find a balance for yourself, and don't feel like you need to go in the opposite direction in terms of an extreme. I don't feel like I needed to go from going 160 miles an hour to 0. I just needed to get back into that safe speed zone.
Well said. Well, thank you so much, Michael. It was so great chatting with you today.
It was great. And I think that, I don't know how Pete Wells felt. I sent him an email once asking him, well, how much wine do you drink? Because you're at a restaurant and, in the days when people didn't recognize who you were probably trying to maintain your cover. So you probably have a little glass of wine. So I asked him, how much wine do you think you consume over the course of a year? But I didn't ask him how he felt personally because I don't know him. But this was an extremely scary thing to do. And to put all of these things out there to tell people that you're not perfect and you've got all of these other issues that are potentially getting exacerbated that you're going to have to correct for, and just kind of laying it all out there was scary. And at first I didn't want to do it. This all started because I just made a reference in a phone conversation with someone at Wine Enthusiast where I just said, that Pete Wells article, I said, that's really interesting. I said, there's a wine side to this too. And then a conversation started. And the next thing I know, well, you should write this art. But it's like laying all your personal stuff out there and those kind of things. So I don't know what Pete Wells went through, but I found out 2 things. 1, it was kind of cathartic. And 2, everybody's got an opinion. That's the case with just writing about wine in general. You'll always get an email or, something where somebody goes, you're such an idiot. That wine doesn't taste like that. Or what the heck does Caro syrup taste? But when this article came out, I received lots of email from people that were either sympathetic and saying, I'm going through the same kind of thing. And I'm having to address all these issues of balance and stuff like that. I had people asking me where they could find Dr. Hassel's Mediterranean Diet Cookbook. I mean, I had a bunch of reactions to this. Only a couple people came at it from the direction of, this is not the message we need to be sending right now. With all the stuff coming from the World Health Organization and the Oregon Health Authority, she said, is a whole other story. We don't need stories like this. I thought they were wrong. Tried to politely answer, and I thought that's putting your head in the sand is not the way to look at this. You can't ignore what's out there in terms of these health messages. All you can do is try to explain them to people in a way that makes sense, that is more nuanced than what these organizations want. And I think that's the key. Don't ignore it. Don't put your head in the sand. Don't pretend like there's no issues.
Totally. And we appreciate you for being candid and sharing your experience because, it's your experience. There's no right or wrong when it comes to that, when it comes to sharing your story. And it's, in case you need to hear it, I'm sure these people who are not only listening, but those who even reached out would agree that it's helping someone. It's providing insight to a symptom of being human, a symptom of being a professional wine taster. And yeah, I think that's pretty cool. So
yeah. And, every time I go to an event now, I'll always catch 1 or 2 people kind of looking sideways. I know what they're doing. And it's I'm down 2 pounds or I'm up 2 pounds. And people are kind of checking to see. Now people are taking an interest in it, keeping track of how you're doing. So I guess I have to roll with that.
Totally. Well, thank you so much again for taking the time to chat on this show. And we look forward to hearing what comes after this whole journey.
Yeah. After the new year, we'll chat again.
How do you define balance with your wine consumption? We'd love to know. You can email us your comments and questions at podcast@wineenthusiast.com. Remember, you can subscribe to this podcast on Apple, Google, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to your favorite shows. You can also go to wineenthusiast.com/podcast for more episodes and transcripts. I'm Samantha Setti. Thanks for listening.